Good morning and welcome to another episode of the Unpublic with Citizen Stewart. Today we are talking about school choice again, which is often like one of our topics here on Unpublic because we want kids to have the opportunity to go to school wherever it makes sense for them. We want their families to have the power to craft for them whatever type of education is best for them. What we really want is for every kid to actually find a seat where they can live up to their highest potential and that they can find themselves. They can find a path to a good life that they need. We live in a country that has so much opportunity for everybody to be able to do the thing that they were born to do. We definitely need schools and educational pathways that help get every single child to that premise, get them to their purpose. But there's lots of obstacles there. There are politics. There are things that get in the way when it comes to policy. And adults like to argue. Adults from all stripe in the United States like to think that their way is the best way. And when it comes to education, we're really in a fight between people who believe that there should be one best system and people who believe that children should be free to learn however and wherever that can happen. So today we want to talk very specifically about Oklahoma, and I'm interested in Oklahoma for a few reasons. But one is a couple years ago started noticing that in Texas there was a group of organized pastors who sounded very much like Diane Ravitch and sounded very much like teachers unions in their approach, and it was very odd to me. Because here were pastors who were fighting against vouchers and school choice programs, and I had never seen anything. I peppered them with questions forever about what is the theological basis of your being against school choice. And I still, to this day, have not gotten from them a biblical, theological basis from pastors who lead flocks to why you should be against school choice. I just put out a tweet saying, does Jesus care about school choice? And I don't know if we can answer that question this morning or today. It's kind of a flippant question, but I'm bringing in someone who I think can help me understand all of this with a bit more clarity. I'm bringing in Chris Brewster, who is not only a pastor, not only a school leader, a person who has started schools, not only a person who is an award-winning educator, but also a person who happens to be a pastor and hopefully has read his Bible and understands some of the things that are in it so that we can have more light on this conversation this morning than heat. So good morning, Chris. How you doing?
I'm doing very well here in rainy Oklahoma right now. It's
rainy.
It's a wet day today, yeah.
Well, I appreciate you being on this morning. This is a very important issue for me. And when I say this is a very important issue, to me, the alignment of clergy and people who you would normally think would be for school choice, getting involved in politics and starting to swim in the sea of politics around political decisions of what we should do with kids is interesting to me. I don't think it's going to stop in Oklahoma. I do think we're going to see this showing up in other parts of the country. Can you give me any type of like just a general landscape there in Oklahoma of how maybe as an outsider, this to me seems really weird, but it wouldn't seem really weird in Oklahoma that this is what's taking place?
Yeah, we've been at this charter thing since '99, I think, is when we passed our charter law, and the first sort of wave of charters came on board in 2000. Santa Fe South, the school that I run, started in 2001. And like most places, I think we were sort of tolerated as some sort of, little anomaly. And then as charters began to gain traction in our state and certainly in others, the more impact that you have, especially in under-resourced and underserved communities, much to my chagrin, the more folks sort of come out of the woodwork against you. And some of those are expected. The status quo established districts and traditional public schools have a financial stake in the game, and we know where they stand many times on this. But the thing that did surprise me, as you mentioned in recent years, is that there's a group of clergy that have come out against school choice. And I like you, have been scratching my head a bit on this. And so I thought, well, I'll just invite them to my school. I'm a bit naive. I always kind of figure if somebody doesn't like me or what I'm doing, it's just because they don't know me yet. And if I just get to know them over a meal or a cup of coffee, surely we can come to terms. But that, as it turns out, has not been the case. It's been kind of interesting.
What is the type of interaction that you've had with them? Well, have you been able to have a meeting of the minds? Have you been able to say, we're pastor, we're clergy, let's talk about the theology of this, or we're Oklahomans and let's just talk about what's good for kids? Have you been able to have a meeting of the mind with them?
Well, I mean, I think that in general, in the essentials, there's unity, right? And we talk about that. But where I've not found in the non-essentials much liberty, and certainly not much charity when it comes to school choice from these folks. And so I just sort of dug into this a bit and tried to figure out why in the world, and I invited Reverend Clark Fraley, who's a pastor, and he's the head of the Oklahoma Pastors for Kids coalition here in the state. I invited him to my school and other pastors as well. And two things happened. One, none of the other pastors showed up. They didn't even come to see our school. And I have frequently extended invitations to clergy and to others to come see the school. In this particular case, I emailed many on their list of folks who were engaged, and only Reverend Fraley, to his credit, showed up. And so we sat down and had I thought, a great meeting. He is an outstanding mind. He thinks well. He, by all accounts, shepherds his flock well in the Edmond area and an affluent neighborhood a few miles north of here. But we really did struggle to come to terms with the fact that school choice and what it would do to apply what I think positive pressure on the existing system to evolve, or frankly to die, because it needs to do one or the other. We did not come to terms on that. And we've had a number of duels, primarily in Twitter, over some of these sort of key concepts. And like you, I've noticed this popping up in a couple of other states. Certainly its inception seems to be out of Texas and has grown to Kentucky. And I do anticipate seeing other coalitions form in other states in the years to come.
All right. So I just want to get very basic about this right now, because I'm a Christian. And as a Christian, I believe there's a certain set of things that we believe, and there's a certain set of ways in which we're supposed to act. And we're supposed to handle these differences in some very specific ways. And we're supposed to care about some very specific set of things. I mean, it's just like elemental. We're supposed to care about the poor. We're supposed to care about the least of these. Oklahoma can't be a state in the United States that has no least of these, right? Like, you guys have some least of these. Let's just start there. Do you?
We the school I serve has 94% free and reduced lunch, is 93% minority population. And across the state, the majority of our kids are free and reduced lunch. So our entire state is majority least of these by certain metrics. So absolutely.
Okay. And some of these pastors that you're talking about who are in school districts that are more affluent, first of all, let me ask, is that true? Some of the pastors we're talking about are in more affluent districts?
Well, Chris, I'd sort of pledged to behave myself recently. And
I'm just asking for facts, man.
But you're going to provoke me to love and good deeds here in just a moment. So I'm going to speak frankly. When I came back from the Philippines, where I was a missionary kid, I was overwhelmed with what I saw as racism and classism embedded in the church of our country. Now, I grew up with people that spent their lives in service, that took their one precious life, highly educated folks, the missionaries that I grew up around, and spent their life serving people. So thank you, my particular bent was toward people who spent their lives in service. And when I came back to the state, what I saw was a very anemic church that was satisfied to build micro kingdoms instead of the kingdom, and generally was orientated around race and class when they sat together in their pews on Sunday morning. So my particular hope early on in education reform did not stem from those that frankly made up the church around me. I do believe the Bible calls us very clearly, and Jesus' example calls us clearly, to spend our ministry serving the least of these. And my first years as a public educator were in an inner city school in Oklahoma City. And I was appalled that the church had abandoned the public schools. I did have the opportunity to serve 2 years in a very affluent district, one zip code away and a few miles away, but an entire universe away from the kids that I had served in South Oklahoma City. I went from a school that had 98% free and reduced lunch to a school that had 2%, a soccer team I coached that had one white kid, to a soccer team that I coached that had one Hispanic kid, and just could not reconcile this idea that in our country, we would tolerate a public system that had such clear class and race divides. And frankly, I think that this opposition that we see is almost always divided among those lines. If I just want to be crystal clear on this, those that cast stones at school choice are most often already those who've exercised school choice by being able to move into a zip code or a school or private school or homeschool their children. And they are castigating those and antagonizing and critiquing those who want that same choice for under-resourced communities. So sometimes I don't get along very well with my brethren that have said that school choice should not be for the kids that we serve. And then I see that compounded with the fact that most of their work is spent propping up what I see to be adult-centered institutions like traditional public schools and unions, as opposed to looking at what our end goal and vision should be, and that's focused around the children we're supposed to be educating. So again, I was supposed to behave myself, but you're gonna bring out some of my thoughts on this.
Well, I mean, I think we should always be specific about getting back to basics. If people are going to wear the label of Christian,
yeah,
I think we should always be willing to go back to the basics. The Christian comes from Christ, and Christ is the Lord, and Christ gave us an example of how to behave in the world. First of all, he didn't always behave. As a matter of fact, that's how he ended up on a cross, was that he didn't behave. He actually was a revolutionary for the least of these. And he told the truth wherever he went, and he overturned money tables, and he put people on the spot about their position in the oppression of other people constantly. And he asked them to give up what they had and to walk with him and to not join the team. So when I see pastors saying, render your children to Caesar, I think it's very interesting, because I think that there is, in that case, I think that there is a biblical conversation to be had that is suspiciously not being had with this group of pastors. Yeah. And so let's just stop for a second on theology, because I think this makes people uncomfortable sometimes in education debates and in education world or whatnot. But you can't be uncomfortable with this if you're going to have the title of pastor and you're going to be out here talking to the public about what we should do with policy on education.
That's correct.
Right? You can't sidestep the inerrant word of God when it fits you. So let me ask you a couple of things from your expertise, not mine, just because I've been very confused by this. Would it be fair to say that the majority of the things that the Bible says about education have to do with rearing children in a way that they would be able to know Jesus and walk like Jesus?
Absolutely. That's absolutely true.
Okay, so if we were to pull all of the parts of the Bible that even make any mention of child rearing or education, the majority of that would be that they would learn the biblical way and that they would learn to love and walk like Jesus.
So the entire concept of education, as I understand it in the scriptures, is emancipatory in its purpose. So it's the freeing of the human being from ignorance so they can discover the author of truth. And when we do education right, literally every part of education reveals God. Even if you're someone who is an agnostic or an atheist, it's still being revealed to you. And so a Christian educator's highest purpose would be to ensure the highest education possible to children, so that through this, they might have a better opportunity to see the one that created them and for their purpose to be revealed. And we see this, I think we see this in the opposite side too. Those that are evil, the Pol Pots, the Khmer Rouge, the oppressive governments of the world, understand that the way you control people is you subjugate them by removing the opportunity to educate them. We see this in our own country. You can keep minorities down if you keep them uneducated. And it's been an implicit and explicit part of our system and our systemic racism that has not been addressed by the church, because we are still content to see vast swaths of our population, mostly poor and minority, remain uneducated because it's easier to control those who are uneducated. So Christ frees us through education. And I think that's one of our essential works as a pastor, frankly.
And I want to be clear for people listening and watching that we are speaking within the Christian context right now, because the Christian context is what's at issue in this particular issue we're talking about. We have pastors and clergy who are literally telling their flock and the public that Jesus would have them support public schools at all costs and avoid any type of choice outside of that, any type of alternative outside of the mainstream system, which to me is a very interesting is the word we use in Minnesota. Bizarre is what we would probably say on the East Coast, somewhere else. It's a bizarre concept for pastors to say that. So looking specifically at what the Oklahoman highlighted and focused, the clergy, to be fair to their point of view, the clergy that we are talking about have a premise for why they believe that it's important to advocate for public schools specifically and against choice programs specifically. One part of this says here, Jesus' teaching is clear that children are important and that we should care for them. A complementary Christian ethic advocating for the sanctity of life should push us to improve the quality of life for all God's children, all of God's children, regardless of where they reside in Oklahoma. Okay, I love all God's children. That means every single one. But the very next sentence gets pretty weird, because now we start showing partiality. Over 700,000 children, over 90% of the total school-age population attend their local public schools. So this is very much a union talking point. The majority of kids go to these traditional schools, so we should only care about them. Think about that in terms of any other majority minority, where you say we should not care about the minority because the majority overwhelmingly do A. I'll ask you, as a pastor, I mean, what about the one sheep that walks away from the 99?
That's right.
Did Jesus say, okay, we're going to let that one sheep go. I'm going to sit here with the 99?
Well, I think you have a couple of issues there. One, it's not a zero-sum game. We do want, in the metro area, for example, of Oklahoma City, we need 105,000 great seats for kids in schools. And I don't think that's all charter schools, and it's not all public schools, and it's not all private schools. But if we could get our collective act together, then all of these kids could have a great place to go to school. But the premise that you're talking about with Reverend Fraley is that he says because only 10% have chosen, we should suppress this choice because it endangers the system that serves the other 90%. There's no biblical concept here that I can find. In fact, we need great seats for every kid. We advocate great schools. We want every single school to be a choice for kids. So I don't quite understand this. What I would say is that closer examination of those that critique public school choice usually reveals that they already sit in schools that they would consider quality. So my invitation to them is say, fine, let's just have your children transfer into the inner city that I serve. And until every single school is a school that you would choose for your children, this work is not done yet. Well, I get no takers on this. We simply get people who sit in affluent communities, in incredibly well-apportioned schools, who are disproportionately supporting a particular and almost always white upper middle class community, who critique those of us that are serving under-resourced communities and say we shouldn't have choice for those kids. Now, I don't find a biblical basis for that anywhere. In fact, I think it should be quite the opposite. It should be those who have much spending their time with the least of these. I think Jesus was pretty clear at the end of Matthew when he was speaking to sheep and goats about how they were being separated and what that separation was due to. Is those of you that didn't serve the least of these are the ones that don't belong to me. And those of you that have focused on the least of these indicate that I am within you. And the Spirit should compel pastors to say, look, I am in a great school. Now let me go work to make sure that every single school is great for kids. And look at these school choice guys. They're doing their darndest to try to provide something. Maybe we're on the same team here. This is why I'm so confounded by this, unless its real motivation is not coming from scriptures themselves.
And that to me is the most important call out for anything called pastors of pastors for Oklahoma kids, pastors for Texas kids,
Yep.
pastors for Kentucky kids. The most important call out for them is, I need your pastoral letter on this issue.
Mm-hmm.
I need you to make it real and plain for the public, because you are not politicians unless you have crossed over from your pastoral duties and become a politician. You are supposed to be acting upon biblical understandings of the world, and you're supposed to be helping others understand that understanding, right? Like, you're supposed to, that's your job as a pastoral leader. So when I look at the Facebook feed for their groups, when I look at the Twitter feeds for their groups, I see zero theology. It's almost as if Jesus has been scrubbed, as if the scripture has been scrubbed. But what I see are the same talking points that I see in Diane Ravitch's feed, in the Network for Public Education's feed, social media feed. And then when I do a little bit of digging, I find a PR group that is actually the basis for all of these groups. And it's the reason why they won't answer my question. Tell me, pastors in air quotes, what is your theological basis for this? And they can't tell me. And I don't want to say it's because they don't have one, because you have to have one to run a church, don't you? To lead a flock, I mean, to become somebody's pastor, someone did some due diligence. Mm-hmm. You had to encounter. So I'm having a hard time not being cynical about, because, listen, Bible always also warns us about false prophets.
Yeah.
And also being too much of this world, and not being enough of the kingdom, right? And I don't know if it's fair for me to say this from a distance about groups of people that I don't know, but I do not hear them talking about the fact that Jesus calls for us to bring children to him. The idea that blocking schools where kids might get into a school where they might meet Jesus should never be something that a Christian does. Anyways, how has this shown up in your life? Because you are more than a pastor. You are also a person who runs a school. You're also a person who has been the statewide charter school president. You also have to live in these communities in a personal life. And I'm sure you have politics like anybody else. How has this impacted your personal life, your personal leadership, in what you're trying to do for kids?
Well, I mean, to be vulnerable in this, it is concerning and disconcerting when folks that do wear the frock or the collar or stand behind a pulpit don't see things the same way that I do. And I am disturbed by it, but I really try to maintain an open mind and hear, as you've talked about, what maybe their stance is, because I've got a lot to learn. I've got an awful lot of growth yet ahead of me, spiritually, certainly. But what I don't see in these platforms is an extension and expansion of the kingdom of God. What I see is a repetition of union talking points, shoring up of a system that has radically failed the children that I serve and perpetually fails the children I serve, and some sort of what I think to be window dressing support for teachers, and a system that panders but doesn't have any substance. So to me, I guess I would expect for pastors to be the first to call me out when my theology is jacked up, for my brothers to step in and correct me and prod me. If we're going to debate the philosophy of public education, I think we can do that all day. But if we're coming from what should be the same foundational belief system embedded in the Word of God, there should be an awful lot more parallel pursuit of the child. The name is a misnomer itself. These are pastor for Oklahoma kids. And yet there is virtually nothing we ever see in their feeds about Oklahoma kids or Texas kids or Kentucky kids. It's all about systems and supporting unions that we know have not been. That unions support employees. That's their whole purpose for being around. They're not focused on the children. That's been unequivocal. We also know that they don't produce systems that serve the least of these very well. In fact, they most often abandon these. So I guess what my take would be is if we're going to say that we are a pastor and that we are going to wade into this public arena, then we dang well better have our theological basis right up front on our websites. I also think we need to follow the money and know who's funding the Texas Texas Pastors for Kids or Pastors for Texas Kids. I'd like to know where the funds come and support for the Oklahoma Pastors for Kids. They say they have a nonprofit, but we can't find their tax filing anywhere. And we've asked for these and haven't received any response. And I think above all, pastors should be completely transparent in these types of things. So I think we need to call each other out if we're going to wear the frock and then speak into a public policy like this. I think you're muted, Chris.
Sorry about that. Thank you. I'll say, as I do every day, to make note of the folks in the comments who bring such wisdom and justice to these shows every day. We're not going to be able to get to all your comments today, but I will point out that every now and then we have one in the group that likes to be the banging gong of ignorance. And this morning is no different than that. We have a banging gong of ignorance in the house, like most days. The internet is great for attracting trolls. We are usually not a troll magnet because we have a family of viewers and watchers who add great deal of educative comments to our discussions every day. But, you know, trolls gonna troll, and we got one in the house today. I just like to call things what they are. And I think all of us as Christian people, those of us who are Christian, we should call things what they are, make the truth plain, because that's actually what the entire faith is about, is the truth. It's about the truth. It's about the least of these. It's about what we do as people, how we interact with each other. I'm bothered by one of the stories you told earlier, though. You know, the thing about reconciling with your brother on the way to court, you know, making an effort to not sow discord. Making an effort to understand each other's position. You run a school with a very high population of students that need more attention from the world, from everybody. And you invite clergy to come see that school, to visit that school. I wonder what happens on the way to court between brothers that they don't show up. Help me understand why there isn't a way for pastors to find a common table to even just talk. Like, let's just, like, the pastors in every state, in my opinion, should be talking about the care of children and the care of kids.
Well, let me be clear. We have dozens of clergy and pastors and communities of faith that are engaged in our schools, dozens, who are authentically walking alongside of our teachers and caring for our kids and tutoring and engaging. That is not the case with the folks on the Pastors for OK Kids. So this is one of the things that makes it clear to me that there's a different point of departure. Those that genuinely follow, in my opinion, the mandates of our Father are in the public schools, are in the private schools, are in the charter schools, working alongside the educators. They're not trying to shore up a system that has failed the kids. And so I guess in my naivete, when I thought maybe we could come to terms on this, I wasn't seeing the real motivation behind this. And I thought, as I do sometimes, that if you could just illuminate somebody's mind on a subject, that they would come over. This is why I don't really care for adults. I much prefer teenagers and below. I've been a youth pastor for many years, and I don't even like grown-ups. I think we kind of suck most of the time because we're set in our ways. We have either chosen to follow the scriptures or we have chosen not to. And my world is divided into two kinds of folks, those that love and serve kids and those other people. And I guess that one of the ways that I speak about this is that this particular person that we're speaking of doesn't seem to have a heart for the least of these in the cities. He and many others exist in comfortable enclaves in well-apportioned schools, and they have either chosen to ignore or are simply ignorant of the plight of thousands and thousands of kids in our communities. and they need to get out and see these. And again, the pastors and lay folk, the church folk all around us are deeply engaged in the work that we do. That's why it makes this disparity so clear to me when I hear people say they're pastors for kids, but that's not the language or the action that I see in their lives.
Are they part of any broader statewide movement around trying to alleviate poverty for the Oklahoma kids? Or is this kind of like their big policy thing that they work on together?
I've heard they advocate for teachers, local school boards, and for unions. Those are the three kind of heavy emphasis that they have.
Okay, wait a second. Let me stop you there. So which book of the Bible did it say thou shalt protect the state's teachers, unions, school boards?
Yeah.
I feel like I've been through the entire Bible in my 50 plus years of life. I feel like I've seen a lot. I don't remember that book, so help me understand where that comes from.
I can't help you there.
Okay, all right. I'm sorry. Keep going. Keep going.
So they advocate strongly for those sort of three prongs or three areas. What I don't hear is the attack on a system that has continued to produce or lack production of its. Public schools have one goal. We are paid to educate the public. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have that coming out the other end, you have failed at your essential work. And so we should be pressing on and expecting our public system and our private schools and our charter schools to meet their primary mission, which is educating the kids that walk in the door. Mm-hmm. And so if you don't advocate for that primary mission, and you coddle those that continue to work within a system that is not compelling the adults to meet the standard, then I don't have much space for you, because you're not taking care of kids. You're taking care of grown-ups, and you're taking care of systems that I have seen be very harmful to the population, especially in South Oklahoma City. The poor kids on the South Side have not been well served for more than 50 years since white flight took the affluence and the pressure out of the system to produce anything worth having.
You know, what's interesting to me, years ago, I had to leave a church because, and this was a long time ago, and it hurt me my family got up and stood up and walked out in the middle of a church service. Yeah. And it was, and I'll just tell this story just because, I like to share. So we were at church, and this was around the time that Trayvon Martin, the situation with Trayvon Martin happened, his murder, and it was a big national event. And I fully expected that when we walked into church that Sunday, that our pastor was going to have a talk with the flock about their participation in racism and their participation in systems that marginalize people, and that this was a national event that was a moment for pastors and others to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And when we got into church that day, he said, God has put something on my heart so strong to talk to you all about today. And I thought, here we go. I'm sitting with my kids. This is that moment. This pastor is going to tell the flock that we can do better in life. And he said, so let me go into it. And then he started talking about gay marriage. And he started talking about how Christians were under attack, and that there was going to come a time where good Christians like us couldn't speak up about things like gay marriage without losing our jobs and our lives. So we had to be strong and vigilant. And God had put this on his heart. And what went through my mind at that moment was like, which Jesus were you talking to that told you that today of all days, that this is the most important thing, when Black communities across the country are reeling from the death of a 17-year-old who was murdered by someone who contacted the police and for no reason killed him in cold blood. And it was a reckoning for me at that moment that we don't all listen to the same Jesus sometimes. And I stood up and with my family in the middle of a session, and we walked out. We found another church, and we've happily been at another church for years that takes racial justice seriously. My only reason I tell that story is it's easy. It's a luxurious theology when you don't ever have to tell your flock that they can do better about changing the world systems, that they have no role in it. It's always better when you can tell them you're the good people and everybody else outside of this are the attackers on our great thing. So when I see pastors not saying, Oklahoma's a very racist state. You guys should actually try and erase the school boundaries. You should try and erase the lines that cage and redline young people in our state into bad circumstances that literally create the lines and the boundaries. And we play a part in that. The districts we live in play a role in that. The way that we have hoarded opportunity in our churches and so let's attack that. But no, what they say is we need to fortify the existing system with all its lines and boundaries.
That's right.
That is redlining young people into less opportunity. I don't understand it. I don't know if you can help me, but I don't understand it.
Well, I mean, I have the same lack of understanding you do then. Anytime we support a system that has been empirically proven over and over and over and over again to not take care of an enormous number of our under-resourced children, we can't support that theologically. We cannot support that. All we have to do then is be introspective and say, why am I so adamant for the existing system? Let me just be honest, because it takes care of me and mine. It takes care of me and mine. Therefore, I don't want to upset the apple cart, because if I do, maybe me and mine are inconvenienced or we have less than. And it's just an absolutely intolerable and it's just a tired situation we face all across the board. We cannot sit back and be people of good mind, good heart, and solid faith and say, this system is okay, and that we should not empower the poor families to have the same choice that our affluent families have. That would be justice. Essential justice is giving our families the same choice that others have, and we don't have that right now.
No, that's a word, justice. We don't have justice. I actually think that it should be Oklahoma Pastors for Justice, and they should talk about what would be just for these kids. If you're living in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and you're talking about some of the poorest kids in some of the poorest areas of the world, if you ask the question, what should be justice rather than where should they go to school, you might come up with a different set of answers, right? Uncomfortable answers. We've been talking a lot about this one group. Are there other pastors that have a different point of view, that are putting their power behind a more broader movement of helping kids?
Oh, yeah, I think we have, in fact, the majority, frankly, pastors and congregations and communities of faith are awakening and continue to awaken to a more essential question. One of the things we ask in Oklahoma City and the metro is, what if we were, and we ask this in church circles, what if we were to create a city that was the best place in the country to be a child? What would that look like?
Oh, wow. I love that.
So when you begin to look at everything you do in policy and education and in your churches through the lens of, is this in the best interest of our children? It just sort of messes with your world. Not is this legal or okay for adults to do, but is it in the long term healthy for our children? Well, communities of faith are asking these questions now and saying, what if we were to govern and to lead and to teach with this idea that we would be judged as a society on the health or well-being of our children, not on whether or not we have a good NBA team or good oil and gas production or anything else going on in commerce? What if our sole metric to determine the quality of our society was how healthy our kids are? What would the church's place in that be? Well, this makes people uncomfortable, right? Because as adults, we're very selfish. We want to keep our systems and we want to keep our cheese where it's at, and we don't want things to be moved around. But if you look at in Oklahoma City and in most cities and say, are the children healthy in this city? And if you cannot say as a Christian, yes, across the board, then we have to mobilize the Church of Oklahoma City, not churches, the Church of Oklahoma City, to address the school of Oklahoma City and say that until every child is adequately cared for in our school system, we haven't finished our work. And I think this agitation is something that is being spoken of from many pulpits and in many places now. A collective vision, I feel, is being finally coming together there's a group called SALT, the Salt and Light Leadership Training. And they're a group that came out of the marketplace, but they began to look at the Clapham circles that formed out of William Wilberforce and those that, their idea was the abolition of slavery, not to buy a few slaves and free them, not to just have an underground railroad, but a kingdom-sized vision to abolish slavery globally as an accepted commerce vehicle. And we think about this from a systems level. We can take one or two kids and we can educate them, or we can pay their tuition to a good private Christian school, or we can start a charter school. We can do something with that group. But systemically, what is it going to take for us to turn this thing upside down, shake it out, and start over again? And that's what I'm encouraged by. We've got a lot of people of faith that are really asking these tougher, deeper questions now about systems.
That's really important, though. If you are intending to keep with your faith, that is in keeping with the faith, to be revolutionary about overturning things for the least of these. Like, isn't that really the story? Like,
yeah.
like keeping the main thing here. Let's keep the main thing the main thing. So this is why it's so painful for me to see people that are ordained to not talk about the revolutionary spirit and keeping the main story the main story. We're supposed to be overturning things for the least of these.
The churches are the ones that came up with education for the least of these to begin with, and for orphanages and hospitals. The church itself established this church-based system to care for people, and then we abdicated our responsibility by turning it over to government. And then wonder why it got wrecked, right? Or we find this pathway of comfort within a system that does not place any responsibility on me. If I can have a public system that takes care of these things, I want a public system. Well, that's really not how the church has operated in its role throughout history. It's in fact gone into areas of deficit and said, we've got to do a better job of this. So I think if we get this right, then us pastors are going to be talking about ways that we can upset the apple cart, not support it in its, at least its current iteration.
I think that part resonates and strikes me as really important, just because there is a question over a long period of time about what does the church do anymore in terms of providing services and providing things that it has always provided. Used to take care of widows and orphans and the poor, used to provide education and had more schools themselves. Their doors used to be open all week long. And now it's not uncommon for a church, even mega churches, to have their doors wide open on Sunday and to make sure that all those technology ways of giving, hey, you can text us, you can live, see us, live on podcasts or whatever, all these different things. But throughout the rest of the week, their doors are closed.
Yeah.
In communities where kids need services, where families need services or whatnot. Do you think any of this has to do with the fact that it's just more efficient for the church to advocate for government to handle everything, because that's efficient? That's an efficient way of doing it. Let's just all pay our taxes and let the government handle that, and then we can keep our churches closed for the rest of the week.
Yeah, I think I don't know about efficient. I think it's letting us off the hook, right? If we've got an entity, a government that we do pay taxes to, that's supposed to do this, then let them go do this, and let's support policies that continue to enhance and expand the government's sort of responsibility and intrusion into this area. And I am a huge believer in the cornerstone of our democracy being in public education. But I cannot understand why we have felt it necessary to carve the church completely out of that. And especially to support it when it isn't caring for the kids that we're supposed to be caring for. I just don't see any room for that. I think that we have further divided the church of the city, of the church of the community, into lots of little kingdoms and little populations, and we've grown way too comfortable. You shouldn't be comfortable when you're sitting in church on Sunday morning. You should be agitated to go do the work of the kingdom. But yeah, doesn't happen much sometimes. So.
This is why I think the question of which Jesus is really important here, because I think if we had an honest conversation that was not about education, people do worship different Jesuses. They worship hippie Jesus, just if it feels good, do it Jesus. They worship kind of like Doobie Brother Jesus, who is just kind of like more philosophical and sits on a rock, like the Sermon on the Mount type of Jesus, but isn't active in the day-to-day. There's some of us that believe in the liberatory Jesus, who actually does overturn tables and tells you why a society is upside down and tries to put it right side up. Like justice is really being rightly related to God. That's what justice actually means in the Christian church, being rightly related. So when you see an upside down community or structure in the world, you want to flip it over and have it be right. Like if someone gave you a picture and it was upside down, wouldn't your first inclination be to, well, if I want to see what's really in the picture, let me flip it over and look at it. That's my Jesus. That's the Jesus that I look at as being the one we should follow. When you look in Oklahoma at what has once been called savage inequalities, the very different circumstances that children are in, what do you think people make of that who are better off when they see, like, my kids are doing well and my school system is doing well? Those kids over there aren't doing very well, but I'm a Christian person and I do care. What goes in their mind after that, do you think? I'm not asking to speak for them, but just how do they make sense of the fact that there are such gross inequalities in their own state and they can see them? It's visible.
Well, I think, first of all, people don't want to see those, because then you're compelled to come up with some type of arrangement in your mind to make sense of this. And what we do is we say, especially in conservative circles, well, if that group would have just worked harder, if they would have just pulled a little bit harder on their own bootstraps, or if their dads would have been more faithful to their moms. We begin to make all of these goofy excuses for why children aren't thriving, so that we don't have to have any responsibility for it. It doesn't matter necessarily what the cause is. We have to be the solution to these if we really are the bringers of what Jesus taught us, to love God and to love others. Mm-hmm. Because what we see so many times is that marginalized communities have been placed in these sort of corners of society and kept there because they give us these uncomfortable truths about ourselves. The fact that we have an anemic kingdom, an anemic church, and a powerful God. How can you reconcile that, right? If God is all powerful, why is it not working in our societies? Well, the choke point is us, right? The choke point is our lack of obedience and moving through the kingdom in the way that we're supposed to. So I think we have to contest these, right? We have to call people out. We have to be called out when we've had flawed mindsets and we believe things. I think you see this just crazy consternation right now in conservative churches over critical race theory and these types of things that are coming up. In fact, our own state has just passed a law that fundamentally makes it illegal to teach critical race theory in classrooms. Now, I just cannot understand that, because the majority of those that pass this would come from conservative Christian communities and would also, I bet my hat, have not even read CRT at all or understand its basic tenets, or they would clearly see the parallels to what Scripture teaches us about marginalized and under-resourced communities. So it's just an amazing thing to me, and it just wears you out by the end of the week, but then you get back up and keep going.
I bet it does wear you out. I get tired every morning. By about 9, I'm already tired. On this last one, so you're a very Republican state, you're a very red state, as you told me. Before we started this conversation, we talked about the fact that Oklahoma passed a law that made it basically legal to run over protesters with your car. Like, if people are protesting and you run over them with your car, it's like literally okay by law now. Excuse me. You also passed a law that made it illegal for people to film police injustices. And I shouldn't say film, that tells you my age, to use their cell phone cameras to capture police injustices. They've outlawed that. And you just mentioned they went after CRT, all in law. Now, this is a very Christian, right-wing, conservative, Republican state. Like, which theology? I don't understand. Like, which? I'm starting to feel like we have different Bibles here, Chris. I really am.
I don't know. I can't find either party in the Scriptures. So again, back to your point on being firmly based in Scripture, and I certainly think that we all have room to grow and are all we're just messes. We're misfits. We are flawed and fundamentally terrible human beings that have been redeemed by a perfect God. And if we were to think and to sit down and to talk and to pray and to read our scripture, I think we would be more closely aligned. But there's so much political motivation and so much pandering that takes place in an election cycle, for example. And I know that many of us are anomalies. I'm a registered Republican, mostly so I can just rankle those that also have an R beside their name. I fund a number of Democrats who I know are good for kids. And so I'll contribute to their campaigns. My essential sort of metric when I'm looking at a politician is, do you protect the least of these in our communities? Do you take good care of kids? Do you support systems that have continued to not serve kids? And that helps me to decide which part of a ticket to vote on. But I think that we have far too little introspection, even in our legislature when it comes to this, and most legislatures, I'm sure. And almost all red state is certainly no different. You would think that the buckle of the Bible Belt would be the best place to possibly be a child, but this is not the case. And so it means that we have a great deal of work to do in our churches, I think, before we're sort of meeting muster when it comes to taking care of the little ones.
I think is so important about this point that you just made is like, you think that the buckle of the Bible Belt would be the place that would be best for kids. It's a very powerful statement to make, and it's a condemnation too. It's a statement, but it's a condemnation of we better get active. If we believe what we say we believe, we better get active. It is interesting to me that the Bible Belt often are the states that are the most dependent on federal aid and the least likely to vote for it. It's amazing to me that the Bible Belt, the so-called Bible Belt, is the kind of the most in need of charity and the least charitable in some ways. And we got to do something different there. I know as we try to land and come to an end here, I do want to know more about how your faith and your service led you to, you started a school and you wanted to start a school for the least of these. You're doing it within a defined system, within the regular system of life. Like you're not trying to do something wild and wacky. You're not, starting some Waco compound somewhere. Good for you. Congratulations. But in your day-to-day life, people don't think about charter schooling, what motivates people to actually go into chartering. As a matter of fact, there's lots of negative projection onto people that want to start charter schools. What was yours? What brought you to the idea that you should start a school and you should serve this population, and you would do it within the normal system that the government has laid out to be able to do it, to be funded publicly, and actually to run a school? What led you there?
So as I mentioned, I grew up in the Philippines. My parents are missionaries, and I met my wife overseas. We both came back, went to college at Oklahoma Baptist University, ended up teaching in an inner city school, and was completely appalled by the conditions in this system. And after about 6 years, I could not imagine spending another year doing this work. The only thing that the system seemed to do worse than mistreat kids was mistreat adults who came into the system ideologically grounded and wanting to be good educators. And it just chewed us up and spit us out. So I thought, I'm going to leave. I'm going to go into fully funded ministry. I'm going to go be a missionary. I'm going to sell insurance. I'm going to be a farmer. I'm going to do something, but I'm not going to keep banging my head against this wall. My principal at that time said, you need to go get your administrative degree. And I said something like, your job sucks. Why would I want to be a principal? And he said, well, you need to go do it. And I went to OU, University of Oklahoma, and studied school reform. And while I was there, I was turned on to places all around the country that were actually doing it. They were schools that were having tremendous impacts in the same types of situation that I was in. And so it just sort of wrecked my plan. I was going to get out of this profession and move on. And then in pretty short order, I got a crazy phone call from a community activist who wanted me to think about starting a charter school. And I didn't even remember that chapter that I'd read, but I went back and thought, what the heck is a charter school? And very honestly, it was a put up or shut up moment between me and God. And Basically, he said, "You've been running your mouth and fussing about this for years, so put up or shut up." So I went home to my wife and I said, we were in this cushy job in Deer Creek now, this affluent community. It's a great place to live. But I think God wants us to go start a school in South Oklahoma City. And my wife, who is much more attentive to the Spirit, and I expected her to say, "No, that's not a good idea for us or our growing family," said, "I think that's where we're supposed to be." So, we started in a church basement with 120 kids and 7 teachers. And despite the fact that I did virtually everything wrong you can possibly imagine, our school survived. So it's clear to me that divine intervention is what has girded the school for the past. We're starting our 20th year.
Oh, wow.
This year we'll have 9 locations and serve about 3,700 kids in South Oklahoma City. And we've got 340 employees, which is more than we had, 3 times more than we had kids the first several years. So we're clearly growing well beyond what we ever anticipated. I have, even in a pandemic year, we have 1,000 on the waiting list now after our first lottery, and that number will continue to grow, just south of 2,000 on the waiting list. So what we know is that our community is clamoring for options, for rescue, and that what we've been able to do in many cases is shift the power of the public institution from the institution back to the public. And our families are now taking that power and choosing. They choose to go to a local magnet school or another charter school, Dove Science Academy, which is exceptional, or Santa Fe South. And it has applied great pressure on our South Side schools to improve or to die. And I think that that's one of the things that I'm most proud of, is that the work of our teachers and administrators has created a tremendous pressure on the local system to improve its product for all of our kids. So to me, I'm just right in the middle of where I think I'm supposed to be, because God won't let me go I do want to be a farmer. That's actually where my heart is. I want to go raise cows, but he's not letting us loose yet. And we anticipate being able to do this work for as long as he'll let us be here.
Yeah.
So
that's such an awesome story. That's an amazing, amazing story. Just a little hint for you, if you do go become a farmer and you want to raise cows, if one of those cows starts to walk away and is going towards a cliff of danger, it's probably not smart to say, well, 90% of my other cows are still within the pasture, so I'm just going to let that one go and meet certain doom.
That's right. That's right.
Just thinking, I think that maybe the Bible tells us something like that. That's apropos for public education. Listen, I appreciate you coming on today. This has actually been as enlightening as I thought it would be. It's very hard to understand these situations from a distance, but I am perplexed by Oklahoma and Texas and Kentucky and the weird confluence of state-loving Christians who abdicate their citizenship within the kingdom for a passport and permanent residence within the world that the Bible warns them against being a permanent resident of. If you're storing up all of your treasures in here and now, and the state and state budgets and state systems, whatnot, how much time do you have to tend to be a real kingdom maker? And I don't understand their lack of kingdom making. Hopefully, and I should ask you this too, we got like a minute here. If you have hope for seeking understanding across lines of political difference and coming back to a Christian table where we don't have this type of discord.
To me, again, there are so many Christians who are actively engaged in this work that they give me hope every day. They work in our schools and in other schools. They are in the legislature, and they are filling our pulpits. So I think the thing that we've been talking about today is kind of an anomaly. And I really would hope that Reverend Fraley would come on your show. He is a very bright man who has chosen to spend his life as a pastor, and I would love for him to come and to speak about maybe his theology. I don't anticipate that he would accept your invitation, but I hope that he would. That would be really cool. I would love that show. That would be fun.
I think actually, I'm glad you said that. I'm going to extend the invitation in a Christian way. And at the end of the day, I actually think that there'd be no reason not to come on if it is about our shared faith and our shared interest in doing right by Christ and what Christ commands us to do. Christ definitely doesn't command us to do to avoid each other in having tough discussions about how we best serve the least of these. That there's nothing biblical about that. So again, for everybody who's been listening and watching today, I appreciate you being here today. This is a different show than we normally do because this has been a faith-rooted conversation, which I don't think we have enough of these. I do think that clergy and churches have a powerful role to play in this kind of secular argument in the secular world that we talk about when we talk about education and schools. So I'm happy to have had this show. Happy to have had you to be on the show with us today because you fit so many different buckets: award-winning teacher, educator, experienced person working within the traditional system and the charter system, and also a pastor with an understanding of what it means to minister to the least of these. So that's a rare profile. You're busy. You must be very busy. So I appreciate your time today.
It is an honor. I really appreciate the work that you do and the thought you put in. It's very stimulating to my mind to read and to hear the things that you write and speak on. So it's been an honor. Thank you for letting me be here.
Well, hopefully you come back whenever anything that you want to talk about pops up or any new issues. If you can help me get to the other pastors, I would love to have them on this show. Absolutely. And for people listening and watching, if you have show ideas, please send them to me. Tomorrow is going to be in office hours. I don't have a guest. So tomorrow I'll be just speaking from the heart. And I think we're going to need to talk a little bit more again about this problem that we're having with understanding systemic racism in the systems that govern the lives of children and govern our kids. So we'll see you then.